Hi, welcome back to Gibi School. My name is Duran Ali. Today we're talking about JavaScript. So JavaScript is our first programming language. What is a JavaScript? So JavaScript is a high-level interpreted language. So this you will learn later. It might not make sense to you what high-level interpreted language is. It's gonna take time to go in depth into what that is, but we will talk about that in the class. So JavaScript is not Java. So you heard Java a lot. So Java is another language that's completely different from JavaScript, and they have the similar name, but in reality, Java does completely something different than JavaScript. JavaScript is an object-oriented language, and that might not make sense to you too, but you will learn that later. It's based on objects, and most languages are object-oriented, and you will learn that in depth in the class. So JavaScript is used in the browser, it's used in the servers, and it runs on something called Node.js when you're trying to use it in the server. So JavaScript was created in 1995, and it was created by a man called Brendan Eich. Let's go to W3 Schools and see how JavaScript code looks like. So JavaScript is one of the most popular languages in the world. It goes on the top of all languages. It's used in almost every website. So that's why we're trying to learn JavaScript, because it's almost used in every website you could think of. So JavaScript is very powerful, and it works in the browser seamlessly. So it was built with the browser. So most browsers support JavaScript. All browsers support JavaScript. As you can see here, we have a button here. So this is some of the things that JavaScript does. So we have a button here. It says, click me to display date and time. So now we don't see the date and time, but when we click it, as you can see, it shows the date and time. You can do this with HTML, and you cannot do this with CSS, but JavaScript allows you to add functionality to your web page or website. So JavaScript is more like, let's say you have a house, and the structure of the house is HTML. The colors and how the house looks like is CSS. And then let's say the electricity and the water and things like that and the energy is JavaScript. So it adds something that you could interact with. That's something that changes frequently. So that is what JavaScript does. If we go to the introduction of JavaScript, you'll see that right here, if we go down here, you'll see that we just talked about electricity, and right here you can interact with this image. So this is just an image, it's not animated, but it's an image. But when you click turn on, it changes the color, so it kind of looks like it's turned on. So when we click that, see, it changes to yellow. So that means the light is on, the light is off, the light's on, the light's on. So as you can see, the page does not change. That means JavaScript is running in the background, and it's allowing you to make changes while you have the page, and nothing is changing around it. So that's how powerful JavaScript is, and that's mostly what's used for, is by changing the page but without reloading it, without changing other elements or other content. So when you're using JavaScript, you mostly will place it in your HTML. So if we go to here, right here, as you can see here, we have HTML document here. Let me zoom out. HTML document, we learned this in the HTML. In the header of the HTML, you could add JavaScript in here. So you could add whatever JavaScript you want, but you have to use the script tag if you want to add JavaScript right here. So this is called an inline JavaScript. It means you're adding it inside the HTML. This is not recommended. This is not the best way to do it. Usually it's best to put the JavaScript its own file, its own document, and then kind of like just a link into it, just like the CSS, link into it, so that the JavaScript is defined in different document or different page, and the HTML is defined here. So, but this is how you do it inline, and you could put it in the footer too. So you can move this script section, this whole script, and put it right before the body, and it will work the same. Usually it's recommended to put JavaScript right before the closing tag of the body. The reason for that is that JavaScript, when the page loads, JavaScript loads first. So if you put it in the header, the JavaScript loads. Let's say the JavaScript is broken, something happened, your page will not load properly in that case. So it's best to put it in the footer so that when everything in the page loads, then the JavaScript loads. So if the JavaScript is broken, then you won't have an issue with your page showing. So that's how you place it. There's also external, a way to place it externally. So this is external, and we'll see example of how to place it. So when you place an external file, you say script and source, then you define the file, so where the file is. This is the path of the file, and then you close it with the script tag. So if you want to put that in HTML, you could put it in the footer. You could put it in, it's mostly good to put it in the footer right before the body closing tag, but you can also put it in the header, so it's up to you. So that's where you put your JavaScript. So next, let's talk about variables. Variables are very, very important in JavaScript. Variable basically is a container for storing data values. So variable is just a container. So you start with var. So var means this is a keyword. You have to use this when you're defining a variable. We will talk more in detail in the lesson, and we'll just touch a little bit here. But var is not used that much in recent JavaScript updates. So but the old way of doing it was you say var and then you define the name of the variable. So here is x, and you could name it whatever you want. So if we go in here and we define the x here, we could say something like give you school or something like that. But it's best to follow convention, which is using a camel case. Basically, if you have two words, you write the first one is lowercase, it's not capitalized, and then the second one you have uppercase. So that's how you define a camel case. So that's how you define usually variables, and it doesn't matter what you name the variable, still everything is going to be the same. It's gonna render the same way, although we kind of like broke it here. Instead of having the x here, we have to replace it with that. So so that's how you define it. So and also JavaScript, it does calculation, so it can do 5 plus 6, which is 11 right here. But we will not talk about math now. But variables are extremely important when it comes to JavaScript. So variables, you could define it in two different ways right now. Like the modern way of defining variables is using let and constant. So before we used to use, before 2015, we used to use var, but var has issues. One of the issues is that, let's say you define a variable called x, and while you code in, you build a whole application, and then at the end of the page, you define x again. Instead of the program telling you, hey, you already defined x, if you want to change it, you have to kind of like follow other rules. var will not tell you that. It will tell you, oh, you want to change it, okay, no problem, we'll change it from x to whatever. So it will change the value of x. So it will say, if you say something like var x 5, and then in the middle of the program you forget that you already defined x, and you say x is equal to 10, and now you have issue and you don't know where the issue is coming from. So so that's why we have constant. So constant means it's constant all the time, and you cannot redefine it, you cannot change it. So but let also redefines, but also let has other properties that we will not go in depth right now, but it is also good to use. So I would say always use let or constant. So that's kind of like the variable, and you could do so many things with the variable. You could define a number, you could define a string, which is a we will not talk about too much on data types, but a string is just a text. So you could put anything in variable, a number, a text, a boolean, let's say true or false, things like that. So that is a variable. Let's go to functions. The reason we're jumping around is because we don't want to cover everything. We want to cover the most important parts, although there are a lot of important parts on JavaScript, but we just want to cover briefly what JavaScript does, so that you can answer the questions on the multiple choice quiz. So functions, what are functions? Function is a block of a code designed to perform particular task. Function is basically a code that you can write to do certain job, and it does that job all the time, and it could repeat that job every time. So for example, when you write in a function, you have to use the function keyword, which is already defined by JavaScript. So you have to use that function keyword, although there is a different way of writing function, but this is the traditional way of writing function. And then you define the name. So this, my function, you could name it whatever you want. You could name it to addition or something like that, or multiplication here. And after that you have parameters. So these are called parameter. Basically you're saying that this function takes these two parameters. So now these parameters, you have to define them. You have to define what they are and what they do. So in here, this function, you're saying return the first parameter times the second parameter. So that's basically what you're trying to say. And the reason why they don't look like anything, they don't look like numbers, you can't multiply p1 to p2, it doesn't make sense, is that we have to call this function. There is a way to call functions, and you give what these mean. So you define what p1 and p2 mean. So right now here, let's go to right here. So in here, we're gonna define, we're gonna call the way to call it. Right now we have this whole thing, document get element by ID. If we get rid of that, usually how you call it is you say my function, and then you define p1, what p1 is. So let's say 3, and p2 is 5. I mean 4. So now if you run this function, it will take 3 and it will take 4 and it will multiply it. So this function, that's its job, that's what it does, that's all it does. So right now the reason we cannot run is because we have to select this element and where we render it. That's why we use documented element by ID and things like that. It's called DOM. Don't worry about it right now, you will learn it in the future, and it's going to be something that you're going to spend a lot of time on that. So now if we change this to something like 8 and like let's say 10, what do you think that is? 8 times 10, what is that? So that's 80. And let's change this to addition. So if you want to change the addition, you just do that. Now what is 8 plus 10? It should be 18, as you can see here. So, and you could do also division, you could do that. So it's going to be 8 divided by 10. It will not make sense. So let's say 10 divided by 2. So we should have 5 here. As you can see, you could also use subtraction. So we have 10 minus 2. What do you think that's going to produce? 8. So as you can see, you know, functions are a code that you can use that can repeat a job very efficiently. And functions are going to be something that you're going to be using a lot in your JavaScript. So as you can see here, you could define more parameters. It doesn't have to be 1. You could add more parameters. I would say don't go more than like 3 parameters. The less parameters, the better. Otherwise, your function becomes kind of confusing. So we did talk about how to call a function. It's called function invocation. You basically call the function, and then you add the 2 brackets, and then just like this one's 2 parentheses, I mean not brackets, 2 parentheses after it, so an empty parenthesis. So if you wanna like define the parameters here, you put them in the parentheses. So that's how you call the name of the function, and then after that you put the value of the parameters. If you leave one value, if you don't define one of the values, let's say here, right here we didn't define, let's say 2, we're gonna have an error. So it says none, so that's an error. The reason for that is because JavaScript will not allow you to just have a parameter and not define it. So that's called invocation or calling the function. So that's usually what functions do. They basically do one task, and the best way to write a function is for it to do one job. Some people, they use multiple things in the function. It does multiple things. You could define a function within a function, but that's, you know, kind of advanced. So I would say kind of you could go to this page and read more about functions. Basically, that's what functions do. Let's talk about arrays. Arrays are very, very important in JavaScript. You will use arrays for so many things. You will use something called advanced arrays or array methods right here, which are more advanced than just arrays. Arrays are just used to store multiple values in a single variable. So we just learned variables store only one element or one number or one string. So arrays are the next level. They store multiple things. So they store strings, they store numbers, they store boolean, things like that. So arrays can store anything. So right now you can make this one a number, you can make this one a string, and this one a boolean. So they can store multiple things, and you could access them by something called index. So arrays, an array is a special variable which can hold more than one value at a time. If you have a list of items, a list of names, for example, storing the cars in a single variable could look like this. So for example, if you want to like store cars, and let's say you have like a dealer and you want to store cars. Now if you want to use just a variable, this is how you define it. So you just each car, you give it a variable, and that's how you define it. That's fine, but that's not efficient. That's not gonna work in a large database. So now variables, that's where variables comes. You could store them like this, and I'll show you how to access them. So if we go down, this is how you access a variable. So accessing a variable, you use the index number. So variables have something called index number. Index number are a numbers that are defined in the variable. Each element in the array has a number automatically. So right now SAP has 0. So every index starts with a 0. So 0, 1, 2. So now it's the BMW is 2. Now if we want to access that, we're gonna go here, and as you can see here, we want to access 0. 0 means the first one, the first element in the array. And now if we try it out, as you can see here, forget about the document that get element, but focus on this part. So this part, as you can see, we're accessing cars, and we're saying give us the index of 0. It gives us sub. So now if we change that to index of 2, let's say, and it gives us BMW, which is the last one. Let's say we access 3, which is not in here. Now it gives you undefined. So that means it's actually not defined. It's not defined in here. But if we add something else, let's say Toyota, because most of us drive Toyota. Okay, now it says 3 is Toyota. So but if you look here, we have 4 elements. So I mean, that means this one is 0, 1, 2, 3. So keep that in mind always. When you work with arrays, they start with 0. Another thing you could do with arrays is that you can know the length of the array. So right here, as you can see, this array has banana, orange, apple, mango. By just looking at it, you already know how many elements are in here. So you have 4 of them. But let's say you have more than 1,000 elements in here. How would you know how many elements are in there? You could use you could take the array's name. You could take the array's name, and then you just say dot length. So that will give you the number of elements in here, the number of things that are defined in the array. So length is very powerful when you're using with arrays. Another important aspect of JavaScript is called conditions, or if-else statements. So conditions are used to perform different actions based on different conditions. So if you want to send a person a different route, whatever they choose, if they choose something, let's say red, you want to send them the red, whatever, the red place. And then if they want to choose blue, they go to the blue place. So that's kind of like how you use conditions, or if and else statement. This is the syntax of if statement. So you say if, and then you give it a condition. The condition could be anything. It could be a number, it could be true or false, it could be different things. We'll see example, and then you put whatever you want to happen after this condition is true. So now if we see example here, we have an example of if an hour is less than 18. So if the hours we have, if it's less than 18 hours, or the 18th hour, then you say greeting is equal to good morning, and now you just render that. So the computer or the browser knows what time it is. So you just define that, and then you say, okay, let's go actually to the code. So you define, you say, okay, now we have here if new date dot get hours. So this part which looks confusing is already defined in the browser. So this is a JavaScript thing that you don't have to define yourself. So you could find it in the JavaScript document. This basically defines, is basically saying today's date, tell me the hour. So that's what it's basically saying. So it's going to give you the hour. So if the hour is less than 18, and this is, you know, military clock, so it's like all the way to 24. If it's less than 18, then render this. So don't worry about this part, but the main thing is it returns good day. So if it's less than, let's say 12, then you could say return good morning or whatever. You know, it depends on what you wanna define. Let's say if it's less than, and this is just one if, so that you could actually connect another if and say, if it's less than 12, say good morning, else say good afternoon or something like that. So now that is how you use if statement. If statement by itself is limited. So now the power comes when you add else to it. Else means whatever happens here, if it's not true, then go and run the else statement. So the else statement, this is how it works. So you have a condition here. If this condition is not true, then run the else code. So this code runs here. An example of it is, let's say if hours is less than 18, run good day. If they are not, then you run the good evening. So that's kind of usually how you use else statement. They're very, very powerful when you use with different things. Almost every programming language has a conditional statement, if else, and also you could nest. So it doesn't have to be one else statement. So if you say if condition 1 is true, run this code. If it's not, run another condition. If this condition is not true, then run else. That's how you connect. And then if you want to add more and else if, you just put it in the middle, and else is the last one, if is the first one, and you could put as many else if statements in the middle. And that, you know, that's how a lot of programs work. They check different things, and they give you the result when they found in a block. This is an example of how you use else if. So first you define, we learn this if statement, and if it's true, you run this. If it's not, you run another condition, which is if time is less than 20, then you give it this. And if that's not true, if none of these conditions are true, then you run else. And else usually is kind of like the default. So if nothing works out, this is, you know, run this one. So that is that's a conditions, that's if else statement, and it's very powerful when you use it with things like loop and things like that. So let's actually talk about for loop, which is also as important as the if statement. So loops usually can execute a block of code a number of times. For example, if you have a racetrack or a running track, you could see that people go around it and you know, they go in loop all the time, just going back and forth. And that's kind of like how loops are until you break it and say, okay, the conditions are met, and now just break the loop, then you could stop it. So loops are handy if you want to run the same code over and over again, each time with a different value. Often this is the case when working with arrays. So arrays give you a number of elements, and if you want to loop through them, or if you want to check each element in the array, this is how you use. So this is how for loop looks like. This is the syntax of for loop. First, you have to use the keyword for, and then you open a parenthesis and you define a statement, and then you define another statement, and then you define a third statement, And after these statements are met, then you can run the code. So this statement, so let's see. So statement 1 is executed one time before the execution of the code block. So it's the first thing that is going to be executed before anything is looped through. Statement 2 defines the condition for executing the code block. So what is the condition? What like how do you want to loop through this? And statement 3 is executed every time after the code block has been executed. So this might sound confusing to you, but let's just break it down. So now here, as you can see, we define the for, and now we'll start with I. So I is just a variable. You could name it whatever you want. I could be anything here, and then we'll start with 0 now. So and then we'll define I, and we'll say if I is less than 5. So this is the condition. So if it's less than 5, keep adding to it, and this is called increment. Basically what it does is it runs it's basically saying I plus I, and then it just keeps adding to 1. So, and you could define this, and you could say something like make it 2 or 3 times or things like that, but usually you increment by 1. So so this code from example above, you can read the statement 1 sets the variable before the loop starts. So it sets the variable before loop starts. Statement 2 defines the condition for the loop to run. So the condition is if I is less than 5, and statement 3 increases the value by 1 each time, and the code block in the loop has been executed. So it keeps running as long as I is less than 5. So there's a lot more to for loop and looping through things, but we'll stop it here. And if you want to read more, you could go to this link. You go to W3 Schools and go to the JavaScript section, and then go to the JS for loop. So you could read more about it, but we'll stop it here. Thank you for watching. Now you could go ahead and answer the questions in the quiz. Try your best to answer the questions. It might be a little more advanced than HTML and the CSS we went through previously. And if you don't pass the quiz, that's fine. You could try it again. There's going to be a button that says go back to the quiz. You could take it as many times as you want until you pass. So try your best, and thank you for watching.